Alrighty, perfect. So just to introduce myself, my name is Elise, and I'm a PhD candidate here at the Centre for Citizenship, Civil Society and Rule of Law at the University of Aberdeen. And for anyone that's new to these events, along with my colleague Maxim, we're organising a conference and summer school on conceptualising community. And this interview is part of a series with our keynote speakers in the lead up to that. So on that note, a very warm welcome to Dilar Dirik, who we're sure will have lots of really interesting things to say today. And I just want to start with a little bit of an introduction to Dilar. So she is the Joyce Pierce Junior Research Fellow at the University of Oxford's Lady Margaret Hall, a post held in conjunction with the Refugee Studies Centre at the Oxford Department of International Development. Her past research, which I'm sure we'll hear more about as well, involved revolutionary women's struggles in Kurdistan in the context of the broader struggle for democratic autonomy. She's currently focusing on two main research projects. So the first is on issues of statelessness and self-determination in autonomously run refugee camps in the majority Kurdish regions of Iraq and Syria. And the second project is on women's justice-seeking efforts in response to violence inflicted by the so-called Islamic State group. She's also an organizer in the Kurdish women's movement in Europe, and she's written extensively about the Kurdish struggle in the international media and in a range of publications, including Open Democracy and Raw Magazine. Her forthcoming book, The Kurdish Women's Movement, History, Theory, Practice, will be published in July, and it's already available now for pre-order. And within it, quote, readers around the world can engage with the revolution in Kurdistan, both theoretically and practically, as a vital touchstone in the wider struggle for a militant anti-fascist, anti-capitalist, feminist internationalism. And I can add a link to the book a bit later on in the chat for anyone that's interested. So today, Dilar will be interviewed by Hanifi Bariş, who is a research fellow here at the Centre for Citizenship, Civil Society and Rule of Law, and who until 2019 was a lawyer in Turkey focusing on human rights law. His current research focuses on experiments of council democracy by the Kurdish movements in Turkey and Syria, as well as two indigenous movements, the Zapatistas and the town of Cherán in Mexico. He's also author of the book, The Kurdish Model of Political Community, a vision of national liberation defiant of the nation state. And I'll also pop a link to that in the chat a bit later on as well. So I'm just going to pass over now to Hanifi to start the interview. And later on, he'll also be moderating the Q&A. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Elise, for the introduction. And thank you very much to you and Maxim and Trevor and other colleagues for organizing the conference and for organizing this talk, which we have been waiting very enthusiastically and are very excited about. Just a couple of housekeeping rules as it's customary. So after the interview, it will be about half an hour. After the interview, we will encourage early career researchers to ask the first questions. And we will expect those who ask questions to introduce themselves a bit, just them and their institutions, if possible. And we would like to ask, of course, those who ask questions to keep questions within the limit of our talk on community and what Dilar will be speaking about. And well, I will try to observe a gender balance when taking up questions to Dilar. So I'm sorry if we won't be able to ask all of your questions, but please keep your questions coming. Thank you very much, Dilar, for being here, and I would like to thank to the audience for being here with us today. It's a great pleasure to have you to talk with us on the topic of community in the context of political communities in Kurdistan, to be more specific. So my first question will be about your recent publication titled Stateless Citizenship, Radical Democracy as Consciousness Raising in the Rojava Revolution. So by way of introduction to your research and the relevance of community to it, what are the salient notions and institutions of the radical democratic citizenship that makes a stateless citizenship and community outside the state viable. So you refer to, quote, theoretical discussions within the Kurdish freedom movement that seeks to emancipate political action from state-centric ways of articulating political will, justice demands, and wider geopolitical interests, unquote. So what can we learn from these ongoing theoretical discussion, the vocabulary in use, and the everyday practices in motion revolving around citizenship and justice that will contribute to envisaging a political community not bound by a state-centric logic? I hope this is not too complicated. So here you go.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hanifi, first of all, for leading this conversation today. And I also want to start out by saying it's a genuine pleasure also to be in the company of you, Elise, Maxim, Trevor, everyone who's organizing this event. And congratulations also for planning and organizing this very big conference at the University of Aberdeen. And thanks to everyone for being here. It's really an honor for me to be part of it. So, as you know, and as Hanifi has announced, there's a lot of ground to cover, so I better get started. Of course, struggles for liberation, for self-determination, for autonomy, independence have a long history in the region. And I think for the purposes of today, I should start out by maybe clarifying that when speaking about the evolving history, theory, and practice of the revolutionary Kurdish freedom movement, or also the women's autonomous women's movement within it, it's important to clarify what exactly we're talking about, because this is not necessarily representative of all the political struggles in Kurdistan and contentious politics in the region in general. But we're specifically talking about a socialist struggle over the last, especially 40 years, a wider movement that is not only confined to a party organization that is around the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is led by Abdullah Öcalan, who's imprisoned, but it's also a wider social struggle, a struggle for meaning giving. It's a struggle for alternative forms of citizenship and political organizing. So it is not just an organization that we're talking about. It's a wider movement that concerns itself also with critiques of positivism in social sciences. It's a movement that claims to develop alternative approaches to internationalism, for example, from a women's autonomous perspective. It's a movement that has put in a lot of effort over the years into questions around ecology. So this wider, what is often called the freedom paradigm, which especially evolved from the 1990s onwards, this kind of shift that happened in the vocabulary and the kind of theory of the movement was linked to wider geopolitical things that were happening at the time, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the failures and limits of state socialism. So it was a quest that connected in many ways Kurdish people's oppression and quest for freedom and liberation, but united it also with the struggles of other peoples in the world, was always also concerned about other questions, not just within the nation state borders of Turkey, but including within that, for example, things like the Armenian genocides and massacres that happened to different communities, the Alevi community, Yazidi community, and so on. So from the beginning, this was a movement that had a transnational perspective, an internationalist perspective, and it was very much rooted in socialist theory. However, its methodology, its practice, especially focused on critiquing the state from the 1990s onward, and that also influenced how it thinks about other questions that are much more global in nature. So the three main principles, if you will, of the movement around democratic confederalism are actually three things that are not only immediately linked to the Kurdish question, which are women's liberation, radical democracy, and ecology. These are three things that are of relevance to social issues and political issues around the world. We are living through a time of war, of ecocide, of feminicide. So in that sense, it's a movement that unites in different ways, organizationally and also ideologically, genocide survivors, guerrilla fighters, political prisoners, workers in their workplaces, refugees, homemakers, and it's organized through these bottom-up communes, cooperatives, assemblies, and congresses. And I think of course, it's important to mention here, this is a heavily criminalized movement. It is a highly stigmatized movement, a highly surveilled movement. Its achievements are massively under attack, also because a major component of this movement is its armed struggle against the second largest NATO army, which is Turkey. And in recent years, of course, many people have heard a lot of praise about the Kurdish people in the context of the fight against the so-called Islamic State, but I think many people don't realize just how much Western states, also Western institutions, have been complicit in the suppression of Kurdish demands for liberation, including basic human rights desires, not even the more radical system change agendas of this movement. And I think it's also important to understand, I know this is a lengthy answer because I want to just establish a few terms before we move on, that, you know, within the ideology of this movement is not just the consideration of Kurdistan, but Kurdistan is treated as as one of the most important issues that should be solved in the 21st century, because it's so entangled with so many of the other crises happening in the region. It involves, you know, thinking very clearly about the way in which the world system is organized along capitalist trajectories, about nation states and borders, and also you can see in the language of the movement, in the writings of Abdullah Öcalan, for example, that the time frame that is considered is a 5,000-year-old time frame that relates to thinking about the state as a specifically imposed form of civilization based on power and violence, and why the women's liberation struggle must be also a central actor in any kind of liberation of Kurdistan, of the Middle East, of the world. So in that sense, we can see there was a shift of this, you know, in the past, traditionally, relatively in a kind of classical Marxist-Leninist approach. It had always its very specific conditions, and also the situation of Turkey and the Middle East is always something that one needs to consider specifically. But over the last 2 decades in particular, we've seen this rise in different places, also in differently implemented ways. Of course, inside Turkey, there's an authoritarian proto-fascist system that is very much embedded with the Western state interests and country or organizations like NATO. So there's an authoritarian, increasingly Islamist, conservative, expansionist, also aggressive militarist government. And there, the struggles of the Kurdish people for implementing these ideas have been heavily suppressed. There are so many political prisoners, so many people have been forced into exile. So we should always remember when talking about the ideas of the Kurdish movement, just how much they're also under attack, just how many lives have been given also for these concepts, and sacrifices been made inside Rojava since 2012 in the context of the regional Arab Spring developments since 2011. Opportunities have opened or have been taken also because there has been a pre-existing political community that is a revolutionary one that has organized around the principles and kind of culture of this movement since the 1980s, actually. The Rojava Revolution became a vital reference point for many people looking for ways out of these ideas that confine citizenship community to state-centric borders. And so there, the struggle looks different. Inside the European diaspora, the Kurdish communities here are also involved in assemblies and in alliance building with different anti-system movements, with feminist movements, with people struggling against racism, against police violence, and so on. So what I want to say is that this is also a movement that is not just in this very traditional way concerned with the human rights abuses, for example, that the Kurdish people experience. These are also important, but the references are not liberal democratic indexes or matrices. It's much more a decolonial, or it's a form of decolonizing life from power, from the state. It's a very spiritual movement at the same time. It has a very deep, very vibrant culture that involves music and dance. So over time, because this is an intergenerational movement as well, there has been this kind of formation of a political community around ethical principles where people who have given their lives, people who have stayed for decades sometimes in prison are highly valued, where people have communal ways of looking after people who are wounded in war, where there's a there's a system of solidarity that ranges really from the mountains of Kurdistan all the way to Europe. And this is why I think it's important to see how very often when we do hear anything about the Kurdish struggle, it's always the military aspects or the positive stuff that like the fight against ISIS, but the much more anti-system approaches, the much more revolutionary perspectives of the movement, the many educations that it has given over the last years, especially to internationalists from different parts of the world. These are things that we don't hear that much about. And I think this is also because in the last years, especially because of the situation in Rojava, so many internationalists, so many anti-fascists have also traveled to Kurdistan to learn how they can organize for liberation and struggles in their own countries. So I think it's very interesting to see that the Kurdish freedom movement has also in the last 10 years, I mean, now we will literally mark 10 years of the Rojava revolution. It's still unbelievable to think about that, but so many new alliances have been formed, so many new concepts like the democratic nation concept, maybe we can talk about that later, which is a different way of conceptualizing community that is not just strictly about the nation. It's not an essentialist idea that there are the Kurdish people, these are their defining kind of characteristics, but how to think about Kurdistan as a society, as a place where new concepts of political identity and struggles can be built, how that it can be kind of a site for new internationalism and to unite also these global causes around ecocide, against femicide and so on. So it's a very locally rooted movement that also has this very universal claim, which is why I think it's very difficult to engage with its ambitious project without, feeling overwhelmed sometimes. But yeah, so I think I'll stop here. I'm sorry for the long answer.
Oh, thank you very much. So we got the main principles like women liberation, radical democracy, and ecology, which we don't see in most other struggles or ideologies. In understanding the resistance resurging Kurdish movements in Europe while doing no harm, you make two profound observations as far as I can understand. I would like to come to your analysis of political establishments in Europe. So am I right to discern that you are making two observations in that short piece? First, that liberal European states are in the business of suffocating alternative political communities abroad by supporting illiberal and oppressive regimes. For instance, Turkey, you refer to it in your answer. So Turkey, who commits war crimes, declare ethnic cleansing before the United Nations General Assembly without any criticism or any backlash, and carries out in Rojava practically. So at home, but European states also stigmatize and criminalize social and political movements that envisage alternative political possibilities or have connections with political and social movements that envisage such communities by labeling them as extremists, both in law and in policy. So do you think this is a matter of liberal tolerance not being extended to non-liberal political alternatives, or a sort of political hypocrisy that is really unsustainable without hollowing out the liberal state in Europe? Or more pessimistically maybe, do you think this is a much more fundamental issue, that liberal or illiberal, this is the state par excellence? In any case, considering that today's undisturbed citizens could become undesired refugees or migrants in any time, in any point, at any point in time and space. Ukraine is a case in point. So why do you think there is not ample awareness of or resistance to the violations of human and citizen rights in Europe in general and amongst the researchers and reporters alike? Again, a long question, I'm sorry, but I contextualize it in that way.
No, it's a perfect question. I think it's a very rich question and it's very relevant to many things that are happening at the moment. I think I am more on the pessimistic side, considering the longer term history also of the approach of especially liberal democratic Western states to different conflicts, not just the Kurdish issue, but I think the Kurdish issue is a very illustrative example. I mean, yes, as you mentioned, there are currently all of these military attacks. Just as we speak, the Turkish state just launched a few days ago another major cross-border military operation against Kurdish fighters in the mountains that fall inside Iraqi borders. The last couple of years have seen the huge military operations inside Rojava, and many of these things go uncondemned. I mean, mainly it's resistance from people on the ground, and also internationalist solidarity and different groups outside of Kurdistan who are raising their voices. But in general, we don't see that there is any political will to actually solve these questions that continue to reproduce violence and also forced displacement. So I am a citizen of Germany. I'm currently in Germany, and just like hundreds of thousands of people, of Kurdish people in the 1990s, we fled to Germany when I was a child with my parents. And it's interesting to me to see how, even when we talk about questions like forced displacement, migration is a very big topic in universities in Europe at the moment, especially since 2015. Even the level of the discussion, the level of knowledge production is so deliberately superficial, because it is designed in a way that evades the responsibility of Western states in the reproduction and production of the global war machine, whether it's through arms trade, whether it's arms production, whether it's active sponsorship of regimes like Saudi Arabia, like Qatar, Turkey, Israel, and so these are things that need to be considered, I think. And I think in general, the state has this kind of monopoly on everything, and it's not just a monopoly on the use of violence or politics, it's also just our imaginaries are so confined to status forms of political action. So people, in times of crisis, they don't know what else to do other than to appeal to powerful states for intervention, for action. So increasingly society is being rendered irrelevant to any kind of aspect of life, especially when it's about actual life. And we're talking about things like war or forced displacement. I think the politics of the UK, the current government's migration policies have even outraged people who are not that invested in questions around system change. In the context of the refugee crisis, for example, so-called refugee crisis in 2015, the Turkish state has basically blackmailed the European Union to curb refugee influx into Europe, and the way in which that was handled, as if Turkey has had no stake in the reproduction of war and violence in the region, as if we should be grateful to Turkey for accepting all of these refugees, when Turkey has actually been one of the main countries to contribute and actively create forced displacement, not just since the beginning of the war, but especially in the last couple of years. So what happens is then we see, as a response to that, very liberal refugees are welcome responses, but that's good and it's fine. It's good that communities inside Europe are kind of having objections to the ways in which their own governments are dealing with these things. I'm just giving, forced displacement as an example of a point I'm trying to make. But, radicals or people who have a much more critical perspective understand how doing things like sea rescue or like stopping arms companies or just organizing shelter for refugees while their own governments are arranging deportations or actually preparing for more wars or building walls, that, solidarity is also being criminalized as migration is being, paralyzed. And what I'm trying to say is that it's so difficult for people oftentimes to see the connections between these things, between war and violence and these xenophobic discourses and the rise of new forms of fascism inside Europe also, because there's often this idea that, here things are fine, at least there's law, at least there are certain mechanisms for accountability. But I mean, nobody is being held accountable for the fact that thousands of people are dying in the Mediterranean Sea. Because of European policies. So I think it's also important to decenter approaches towards citizenship, to democracy, to human rights that take European or Western frameworks as the main key point of reference. Because as we should know from history, the so-called Western world does not have a great track record when it comes to freedom, to liberation, to equality. So it's kind of difficult to understand why this should be the case now. And I think movements at the margins of the nation-state system, people who have been at the receiving end of state power, for example, have much more profound critiques and analyses of what the state is and what are the limits of political action inside the state framework. And I think criminalization actually is a very, very good way to analyze that, because with criminalization of very basic things in the UK, for example, increasingly we expect to see more surveillance, more police brutality, more kind of police action and protest, the criminalization of gatherings. These are all very dangerous things, and they always get justified with references to national security or other things. But these are contemporary European forms of authoritarianism, and they function through propaganda, through perception management. But these are not words that we use when we talk about Western states. We are very generous in applying these to countries like Russia, and we definitely should, but these also apply to the much more subtle, much more kind of hidden and institutionally backed forms of violence that the Western world continues to implement either directly or indirectly to other parts of the world. So I think in that sense, what I'm trying to say in response to your question in particular, I think learning from the criminalization of political action outside of the state, whether it's, for example, struggles like the ones in Kurdistan, the immense violence that the alternatives that people there are trying to build are exposed to, but also seeing how increasingly anti-system movements inside countries that we would consider to be liberal democratic, countries that are basically on the boards of all the human rights institutions and safeguarding mechanisms, justice mechanisms in the world, including also the UN system, the way in which the UN system is designed. So everything is functioning on the logic of the state, and people who are not inside the state system because of who they are, for example, groups, collectives like the Kurds and others, they systematically, their energy gets drained. It's oftentimes better for them to even not look for solutions there, because the more radical kind of revolutionary perspectives that they may produce will just be diluted or marginalized at the expense of, and we see this, and one last point, there have been, for example, since the 80s, 90s, so many autonomously organized refugee-led organizations, for example, in Europe, by Kurdish people, by others, and so on. But now, since 2015, we've seen that countries like Germany, for example, again, they are also having a very selective approach to what kinds of initiatives, what kind of groups of refugees, what kind of profiles they want to advance as the ideal good refugee, and the ones who are kind of, more on the protesting end, who are having objections to the ways in which countries like Germany are invested and involved and implicated in the war crimes and human rights abuses in other countries, they get stigmatized, and anyone who's in solidarity with them gets stigmatized as well. So I think criminalization is a very interesting lens to study liberal state power, and to also understand how that also contributes to the repression of alternatives in other countries.
Thank you. Picking up from your point that it might be difficult to see, all these connections within the large scale of European politics, and learning from the criminalization or stigmatization of certain groups, I would like to point our finger at us researchers, and of course, coming from your text, the same text. So you refer to, in the Understanding the Resistance, again, you refer to a practice of extractive research and urge researchers to have, I quote, a heightened ethical and political awareness of power dynamics when carrying out their work, unquote, especially when learning from or studying with vulnerable individuals and communities in Europe, such as refugees or migrants. So you mentioned that some have experienced, of course, genocide, war, large scale, in a large scale, and forced displacement, and in their homelands, and that here in Europe as well, they are subjected to surveillance and raids, protest bans, travel bans, deportations, etc., if they are politically active. So naturally, all these impact research, our understanding, and the way we, of course, try to understand the world deeply and widely. And as you point out, their stigmatization and criminalization, again, I quote, impacts their willingness to speak, to openly speak their mind, unquote. So can you elaborate on this a little bit, please? So some of us probably have never seen other worlds and have no first-hand knowledge of or experience of how our research can harm others, our interlocutors or participants. So let's assume that I consider Europe as the land of the free and have no clue about how research practices that I picked up in higher education institutions in Europe can harm others or be harmful and perpetuate the stigmatization or criminalization. So how can we keep our eyes open and avoid the pitfall of this extractive research and harmful practices?
Yes, thank you so much for this question. I'm very passionate about this question because I think I also made mistakes. I learned also from other people, and it's because I need to put into context what happened in 2014 in particular. That was the year when, of course, ISIS made global headlines after especially the genocide on the Yazidi people in Shengal or in Sinjar in early August 2014. And that was the first time on a larger scale where people in the world who don't have specialist knowledge on the Kurds or the Middle East came across the Kurds. And they came across the Kurds through a very specific context, namely seeing women fighting against the so-called Islamic State. And so many people didn't know who are the Yazidis, where do the Kurds live. So all of these things were new, and there was very much a narrative, a discourse that was filtered through very sensationalist kind of reporting about what had happened, and so much of it was problematic. And of course, it created this perception that, you know, these people just kind of, I know we may talk about this in a later question, but there was this rush of knowledge production on the Kurds, on the Kurdish struggle against the fight against ISIS and so on. And everything happened so fast. And of course, the Kurdish people historically, there has been a policy, a systematic policy over the last century in particular of denial of no knowledge production, criminalization of knowledge production, criminalization of the Kurdish language and identity, especially in Turkey, for example. So then suddenly that this community was then bombarded with all of these, I really say bombarded because I think many people probably felt that way, that the day before nobody cared that they were being genocided and killed, and now suddenly journalists, researchers, everybody was asking questions. So there was a specific moment that happened in 2014. And I think there was this, I called it in the article, industrial scale contact between Kurdish activists and also, you know, researchers, journalists. And if you look at what happened in the context of Europe, is that inside Europe also, although this is not the Middle East, especially in countries like Germany, the UK, in France, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, those are the countries where many Kurdish people live and where the Kurdish movement is also organized. People showed up and asked all kinds of questions. Many people were very good people who just wanted to study and to write about something that they didn't know much about. But I think it happened with a big lack of sensitivity towards the criminalization and surveillance and violence that this community has also experienced from European states. So there are often very stigmatizing news reports, documentaries, especially in Germany. And I know this also because I grew up in Germany. So in other countries, it's slightly less so. There's also very huge investment also from the Turkish government in Germany, a lot of intelligence sharing between the Turkish government and the German government. So I think what I wanted to say in this article was that, you know, these counter-extremism policies that have been on the rise since 9/11, police brutality, surveillance, and so on, really impacts the psychology of people and their ability to freely speak about their political projects. So on one hand, you have people wanting to talk about everything that nobody talked about before. It was this kind of moment of freedom where people were for the first time being given microphones. So many activists were overwhelmed. And I think it happened to me as well. I was in my early 20s and I was asked to talk about what's happening in Kurdistan, and I didn't feel qualified, but so many people were asking, and so many people just kind of started talking without any experience of what does it mean to work with media, and who is this person wanting to interview us. And it turned out many of these people were also not good people. They were gathering intelligence. They were using the knowledge that they produced for purposes that activists were not expecting to be the case. So I think those were very major problems that happened at the time due to lack of experience or lack of awareness. But I think what I wanted to stress is that this is a learning experience that people can actually use to enrich critical perspective on not just how to produce knowledge on political communities, but also on state power, and how knowledge and power, again, this is not a new thread, of course, many people have written about entanglement between knowledge and power structures, but I think the way we talk about long repressed resistance movements, it comes with a huge ethical responsibility. So this does not just mean that you should protect people's identity and, look for basic things like anonymity and things like that. So many of these things are things that undergraduate students learn when they first start to do research projects, right? So how to, especially when working with vulnerable people, but I think political activists are not often seen as being a vulnerable group, although they're the most vulnerable to state attacks, to surveillance and to deportation and all of these things. So because they're putting themselves out there, people think we don't need to protect them if they're already doing this, kind of criminal, dangerous work. So what I wanted to say in this article in particular is that we can actually learn from the experience of movements, about states. It's not maybe so important for activists, for scholars to write about these inner intimate dynamics of inside communities as it is to maybe allow and give space to these people to organize and do their work by focusing on how they are doing this under difficult conditions and what kind of state mechanisms in international intelligence cooperations or just media stigmatization generally, of course, especially in the context of revolutionary socialist movements, ideologically, the environment, the climate is quite hostile to this kind of politics. So how can we make sure we don't reproduce specific kind of tropes that stigmatize a radical anti-system rage and kind of forms of political meaning giving? For example, often people call the Kurdish movement with words like it's a cultish kind of weird group, and like many of these things, they also come from Turkish state propaganda. And people get surprised when they actually go to a protest and see that it's a movement that really functions through solidarity, through mutual aid. There's a very deep sense of friendship, of huge music culture, and it's a decolonization project. So of course, it's a mass movement. It comes with all kinds of problems. So I wonder if it's possible for researchers to actually shift their attention away from, very, very micro politics of a mass movement, which is very difficult to capture anyway, and to write in a way that can learn from this experience, also by engaging with this own movement's terminology and critiques of positivism, right? Like it's one of the main things in the ideology of this movement to be critical of approaches like researchers just coming and talking to a few people and then making huge claims about their lives, right? This is something that feminists have critiqued, that many critical scholars have critiqued, that, how we do ethnographic research, reflection on positionality power is important. But I felt that people didn't do that when they kind of just launched themselves on Kurdish communities, asking, so how do you organize? How do you do this? What's this about? Not realizing people may not want to share that. And I think, here's where, looking at counter-extremism policies, how those impact people's ability to make even basic liberal democratic demands, it's often rendered impossible because of stigmatization. So I think researchers have a huge responsibility towards political movements, especially those that are, they don't have to sympathize with them, but they need to just be very careful that, oftentimes they're whether they realize it or not, whether they do this deliberately or not, the research they produce can sometimes help states to further criminalize entire communities.
Dilar, thank you very much for your answer. I feel like my questions took longer time than your answers. So I had a limited number of questions to ask, but we don't have much time. So I feel very generous. I will start accepting questions from the audience in order to give them more space to ask their questions. So as I said in the beginning, please do early researchers come forward and ask your questions. And of course, sorry, I think somebody's microphone is open. So any questions from early career researchers? I'm opening the floor.
Can I just say thank you so much, Hanifi, for your very detailed questions. They really did give me a lot of space to explore. So I really, really appreciate it. And I have to say, I think I gave very long answers. So yeah, thank you. And I look forward to the questions from others. Thank you.
Well, I think there is a lot to cover, of course, and we don't have much time to cover every aspect of your answers or my questions. So we are much obliged for your candid answers and very detailed answers. Thank you very much. And please, of course, we would prefer that you switch on your camera and microphone when you ask questions, but if you don't feel like it, of course, you can ask your questions over the chat. While waiting, maybe I can ask a quick question from my long list of questions. You mentioned, of course, the genocide against the Yazidi people in 2014. And I remember very vividly from a question from a German journalist back then. I don't remember the outlet now, but he was basically asking when these rescue efforts were taking place to rescue the people stranded on the Mount Sinjar, about 100,000 of them, who escaped genocide just barely, and who were on the brink of death because of the shortages of water and food. And the armed forces from within and without of Rojava, the Kurdish armed forces, opened a corridor and took them to safety in Rojava, to refugee camps, of course. So a German journalist was asking, who are you people? Where did you come from? You incredible heroes, why didn't we hear about you? Something along these lines. So I want to just ask you to quickly take us, walk us through the way where specifically the women armed forces within the Kurdish freedom movement, specifically in Rojava, came from, if you can, while we are waiting for the questions to come forward.
Sure. Yeah, I think this is a great question. And I think I'll start out by quoting Meral Çiçek, who's a long-term revolutionary and writer and journalist in the Kurdish liberation movement. I think in 2014, she wrote an article on this topic, and she used the expression, the YPJ, which is the Women's Protection Units in Rojava, did not fall from the sky. And I think this is a very good way of putting it, because of course, women in Kurdistan have a long history of armed struggle also against, in addition to other forms of struggle against occupation, state violence, genocidal regimes, and other forms of oppression. And inside the Kurdistan Workers' Party movement, women were part of the guerrilla from day one. So we're talking about early 1980s. But they increasingly joined in the 1990s during the Turkish state's village destructions. But actually some of the early women who joined, they also came from Rojava, because Rojava, Syria, Lebanon, these were areas where the headquarters of the movement were before shifting to the Kandil Mountains, more inside Iraq, Iran, Turkey corner. So there are tens of thousands of women who joined from inside Syria to fight against the Turkish army since the 1980s. And now there's so many different affiliated organizations and armed struggle kind of units in different parts of Kurdistan from this tradition. So autonomous organizations specifically started in the early 1990s, when increasingly the struggle against state also was connected with the struggle against patriarchy in Öcalan's writing, and also thinking in the movement in general. So it was in a very entangled way, an organizational and an ideological decision for women to organize, because historically women have been deprived of the ability to defend themselves. This is something in the ideology of the movement often mentioned, that every living being has mechanisms to defend itself, but in the case of human society, women have been systematically deprived. And this has to do with the history of the state. So this autonomous organization of women, guerrilla, started as early as then. So now they're independent, separate forms of decision-making, operations, conferences, diplomacy, media, and so on. So this history goes back, but to come to your question more specifically, in 2014, again with the YPJ, with the struggle inside Rojava, especially against ISIS, with all of these headlines coming up, there was this momentum. I interviewed one YPJ commander. She said the Kurdish women have struggled for decades, but the YPJ broke this information embargo that was about them. So it created this kind of opportunity with women in Kurdistan, in the Middle East, and in different parts of the world to talk about the urgent need for women's self-defense and what that means. And women's self-defense, not just as a physical form of defending yourself against state violence, patriarchal violence, but also how women's collective organization, how women's mass organization is a form of self-defense. Women's autonomous media, women's autonomous knowledge production, these are all forms of self-defense. And I want to say on this note, though, that it's very important to mention and realize just how much of the ideological aspects of the fight of women against this fascism that Daesh represents, was distorted in media outlets in especially the West, because they focused on this in a very, I would say, erotic fashion on the aesthetics of this women. They were called badass, and especially after the US, kind of helped with airstrikes in 2014 onward. And there was a systematic effort to erase the politics of this movement. And there were very clear, I think, editorial guidelines on how to write about who these women are in a way that divorces them from this much longer socialist history. So I think this needs to be put into different global contexts. Also, for example, of course, Islamophobia. Many people focused on Kurdish women because they are Islamophobic. And although many of these women are Muslims, of course, themselves, not all, but so I think very similar at the moment, also literal allies of Turkey in Turkish occupied areas in Syria, they're doing very similar things to what ISIS did. They kill, they mutilate, they kidnap and abduct Kurdish women, but there is no outrage. So right now, nobody's talking about Kurdish women fighters because Turkey is killing them. It was okay to glorify them when they were fighting ISIS. So I think what I want to say just now, and before wrapping up this question, women in Kurdistan didn't fight against fascism because they are there's something inherently badass about being Kurdish or Kurdish culture, or because it took a group like Daesh, like ISIS, to awaken women. I mean, for millennia, women everywhere have resisted in different ways and against patriarchy, but this was rendered invisible. But also a defining factor here was organized struggle based on revolutionary principles. That was what enabled this resistance. So the defining factor in this case is that, and I think people fell in love with these easy narratives that were circulated in the media, especially between 2014 and 16, because they felt comfortable and comfortably familiar from these basic cliche Hollywood movie plots that, women have to experience violence and then they fight back. But this is just not what happened. The truth is that there are entire anti-patriarchal armies in Kurdistan, and also male guerrillas who are fighting for actually women's liberation because of this decades-old revolutionary socialist movement and its leadership and its perspectives on patriarchy in the state. And these women have for decades fought against NATO. That's why they had the experience to fight against ISIS. And now NATO is working with ISIS-like, via Turkey, with ISIS-like groups on the ground in Syria. So it's not up to anyone, I guess, to distort this truth. And there are tens of thousands of women who died as evidence of this. And I think in my book, actually in my forthcoming book, I define what happened here also as a form of special warfare. I think talking about military people or all kinds of journalists working for outlets that are recognized as like mouthpieces of political establishments. This was deliberate, you know, this was not just basic Orientalism or ignorance. I think this is very deliberate. And I think recognizing and appreciating these radical trajectories is also important on how we produce knowledge on speaking about the topic of our day, community, especially political community, because these are radical collective histories, these are sacrifices, this is long-term labor of people that gets erased. And all the victories that people may have achieved, it's important for us to understand where do they come from. And these are based on ethical principles, and you know, we need to understand how political communities reproduce themselves and how they can also render their achievements lasting. So I think being very, very careful and aware, again, this links to the other question you had, about the ideologically distortive nature of how certain discourses can kind of talk about otherwise criminalized movements is very interesting, and it's hopefully something that people will explore more in depth. I think still just the last point, I still get emails from students, for example, wanting to write about media representation in the West, about the Kurdish women fighters, but I personally think it's time to move on. This is a topic from 2014-15. Right now, the same movement are facing existential attacks. These women are killed systematically. There's so many women in prison, so much forced displacement. So I think, again, I find it less interesting now to talk about the fetishization of Kurdish women fighters in the media because it's over. Now there's a systematic rendering invisible of the resistance of Kurdish women. Maybe that's something for people to connect why in certain moments we talk about resistance and in other moments we don't.
Thank you very much for this elaborate answer. I'm guessing or hoping there will be more questions about specifically women organizations or genealogy. I didn't have time to ask, but we have hands up. Riyak, am I pronouncing it rightly? Go ahead, please. The floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. I'm just blown away by this interview. It was really interesting and always great to hear Dilar speak. I'm a PhD student at the University of Cambridge and working on collective forms of women's employment in Benin, West Africa. So a very different context, but similar themes. And I wondered, Dilar, if maybe, well, I'd love to hear some more maybe anecdotes or stories from your data and your time with these women. If you could just talk to us about kind of examples of community that you saw when you were spending time during your PhD research.
Thank you so much, Rijak, and thank you so much for being here. It really means a lot to me. Thanks for making the time. Can I just ask Hanifi, are we collecting a couple of questions or should I just respond to her question first?
I think you can go ahead with one by one, yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, like I said, thank you for your question. I think what I found really, really empowering also for me personally, but just, you know, in general, when doing field work in Kurdistan, and I did it inside the borders of Turkey, Iraq, and Syria, but within the Kurdish regions, Kurdistan basically, was that how diverse and different community can be, even inside a movement that is considered a political community, you know, because community is something that changes, like is redefined according to people's needs and current context and whatever it is that they're going through at the time. So sometimes community means it is the only thing that actually prevents a genocide. And I think this is what happened, for example, in the resistance that happened in places like Sinjar or Shengal or in Kobani, is because there was a community that was politically organized and familiar with each other, that had existing political mechanisms and forms of organization in place, that they were able to evacuate, that they were able to kind of inform people ahead of time, that they could create a momentum of international solidarity. So literally, quite literally, in the worst moment, it was community that, well, states or institutions, including UNHCR, for example, which is formally in charge of a camp inside Iraq, which is called Mahmoud refugee camp, which is very much entangled with the Kurdish freedom movement. UNHCR did not assist the evacuation of that camp when ISIS attacked in 2014, but it was the existing political community that did it, and without any civilian harm. So sometimes community meant that huge trust nothing but trust in your community sometimes can help you survive. In other cases, it's something different. Sometimes it's clashes, sometimes it's actual conflict. For example, inside Rojava, there are these women's houses. That's how it's translated, the Malajin. And these are basically institutions that were created from 2012 onward, especially in villages and cities. And these are part of the revolutionary women's movement. And they are not shelters. There are places where you can go. So sometimes if you need shelter, they can organize it. But basically, it's where women can go to get help with things like domestic violence, with issues they may have, if they seek employment, if they're in a difficult situation. So it's a form of believing women in a society where historically this has not happened. So there are also justice and ethics and kind of protection-based forms of community that the women's movement specifically created as a form of defending women collectively against patriarchal violence while the other struggles are going on. Sometimes community is something that relates to diplomatic relations between communities. In the women's movement literature, actually vocabulary, I should say, the word diplomacy isn't really used in the Kurdish women's liberation vocabulary. It's the term that is preferred is strategic alliance making, because diplomacy is associated with the state system. It's something that states do, or men in suits do. They sit and then they argue and fight, and then they reach a compromise. But alliance making between communities is something that women have done also. For example, there are Syriac women, Arab women, Turkmen women, Circassian women who are working actively with the Kurdish women there in organized, coordinated fashion to create also a community of women in northern Syria, you know, so beyond their cultural backgrounds, beyond their religious backgrounds and so on. So this is what I mean. It's like so hard to think about community in just one way, because it relates to different forms of political action, different forms of identity also. Sometimes a community means the merging of different cultural identities, ethnic, religious, linguistic, whatever, into one, for the purpose of, for example, defending the area from occupation or for creating a new democratic political system. And sometimes community is struggling against your own partner, against your own, you know, the man or the whatever, the women, anyone inside your own family, to democratize it. So it's like something that is inside of you, outside of you. You develop new relations as you go. And I found that very, very inspiring. So inside Turkey, it may look different because there, the system that people are up against looks slightly different. So there, it's also about creating solidarity structures with, you know, people resisting at the workplace, with women in rural villages, you know, the youth movement, universities, and so on. So you see what I mean? It's like, it's a way of bringing people and their identities on the same table around certain principles, some of which are not negotiable. For example, it's unheard of in an environment of the Kurdish political freedom movement of this kind to just get up and say, I no longer accept that women's autonomy should be a principle. This will be just canceled. This is a cancelable position to have. You can discuss it and you can, you know, want to be convinced. You can, of course, raise it and say, I'm not super happy with it, but nobody's gonna now re-debate that after decades of agreeing that this is the basic principle we should have. So there's certain things that are not really on the table, but they're very basic. Everything else around them, the details, for example, how to exactly organize ecological initiatives, how to exactly organize women's solidarity structures. These are all things that happen in discussion. And this is the thing that is maybe the most invisible thing about the Kurdish freedom struggle. Are two things. One is that it's an eternal amount of meetings that happen, so many discussions, and people get shocked at the amount of meetings and gatherings and congresses that happen in the movement. But that's part of its political kind of decision making. It's not just, there are certain centrally taking decisions, but they get discussed and implemented in the local in so many ways. So much of it is that. It's not just somebody says something and everybody does it. No, there's so many meetings where these things are discussed. The system in Rojava has changed so many times because of, a result of discussion. The women's laws, when they were first issued, they were first discussed everywhere with the women's houses, with the women's academies, with different interest groups before they were implemented, and then the implementation was discussed. So everything is quite efficient, but also slow. And secondly, the importance of political education. So much of the ideological, strategic work of the Kurdish liberation movement, including the women's liberation movement, is about familiarizing people with these ideas, with these concepts. You cannot just say to people, reject the state system, it's bad. Patriarchy is bad. You need to actively convince people that, power and violence are entangled. What's the relationship between capitalism, patriarchy, state, and so on. And this happens also through the movement's media, through television channels, through publications, through protest cultures, and so on. So that's why I think, it's the community that exists inside this movement is not something that just kind of happened because people liked socialist ideas. It was actively curated. It was a huge pedagogical and ongoing kind of progress and kind of process as well. And I think what I find just, to really come to speak to the heart of your question, I think for me, the most kind of liberating side, and maybe this is just my childhood self speaking here, growing up inside like the Europe aspect of this movement, just seeing how many elderly women are part of this movement, how much there's space, not just aesthetically in like how people record videos and stuff, but genuinely, of course, they don't participate as much as, people may hope or want or wish or make space for them to make it also possible. Women are held back from political action for so many reasons, including patriarchy in our communities, but also other issues. But the kind of joy that you can see among elderly people, among people with disabilities, people who have no formal education, this is really a movement where the marginalized and the poor find a place. They may not be the most present, they may not be the ones on the TV programs and explaining things, but they are there because there's a space made for them and because there's love for them. So this is the thing that I mean when I get a bit more kind of emotional when speaking about what community means in this context, is that I don't think this is a movement that is excluding anyone. I think everybody can potentially find a place. There still needs to be more space, for example, for queer struggles, for different things. There are still people who are maybe not as comfortable, but the potential is there because the space for discussion is there. So I'm so sorry I'm giving so many long answers, so I'll try to censor myself from now on, but I can't help it because your questions are very meaningful and I want to do justice to them. But thank you, Rijak.
Thank you very much for the question and for the very passionate answer. We can see your passion and how you are really into this world of probably creating new words and new meanings. We have a question from Gal in chat, but I think his question can wait. We can give the floor to Cansu because her hand was up before Maxim, and then we will go to Maxim in order to observe gender balance, maybe then Elise. So Cansu, floor is yours. But please, then from now on, because we don't have much time, we will keep our questions and answers a bit, limited. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hanifi, and thank you very much, Dilar, for your very enthusiastic explanations of the situation and your work. I'm really impressed, and thank you for the organizers, Maxim and Elise. Thank you very much. So I have two questions. By the way, I'm a PhD student at GSSI, Grand Social Science Institute, in Urban Studies and Regional Sciences. So I have two questions I'm curious about. First is, can you open more your reflexivity and positionality in your work there? Because I'm very curious on this. You have done a lot of ethnographic research and field visits and so on. So I'm wondering, especially the Rojava part, Syria part. And then secondly, I'm also interested in forced displacements and resettlement in Turkey's Kurdistan because of, due to this mega projects like dam projects, like Southeastern Anatolia projects is one of them. And this forcibly displaced people and their embodied emotional experiences afterwards. And so I was wondering, have you observed struggles over water in your, like, during when you were doing the field work? So, and how was it like, because the Tigris and Euphrates are also transnational rivers, and I think there are huge impacts in Syria, Iraq, and the Kurdish community there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cansu. I just noted your questions. Thank you so much. I think these are very good and crucial questions. As I promised, I will be shorter in my answers now. I will try my best. So to come first to the question about positionality, it's something I really struggled with because it's difficult to be taken seriously when you write about a political movement that you grew up inside. So people just naturally assume that you are, partisan, that you are, you come with an agenda. And to be honest, I think over time, I just stopped, even thinking that we should pretend that this is not the case. I mean, first of all, no researcher, nobody is without ideology, without kind of a cultural, social, political upbringing. It's not my fault that I grew up inside this kind of context after my family was displaced when I was a child. And initially, when I started writing, it was before this big hype. So I started writing about Kurdish women for my master's thesis in like 2012. And then this was the time when, for the first time, the Rojava revolution erupted. Shortly after, there was a big, crucial, very huge breaking point for me was the killing of Sakine Cansız, Fidan Doğan, and Leyla Şailemez on 9th of January in 2013 in Paris. By an operative with links to the Turkish intelligence. So at that time, I felt this urgent need to write about this movement or these women that I feel that I know they're part of my life, but they're like ghosts that nobody else notices. And then suddenly in 2014, people saw the labor of these women. And then the way in which the topic was talked about, I found it very hard to kind of navigate where am I, who am I? But also, of course, I have immense privilege, immense power, considering that I am doing my work at a UK university. I had access and, kind of exposure to people who are, I'm very safe, so I'm not ever claiming that I am in the same boat as people who are at the front lines or in prison or in danger. In Kurdistan, I always make this clear also, is like I'm trying to be communicating what I feel needs to be heard and what we should hear more about. So in my work, I usually try to center what people are saying, the stories that people want people to know. And I do a lot of translation work as well. So I think these are things that I found difficult to manage, but of course my connections existing from Europe, for example, opened so many doors to me. It was not difficult for me at all to kind of find people to interview, to gain access. Like people trusted me, and I mentioned this in the beginning of my forthcoming book, that people saw me as something like a child of the movement. People often called me that, or a heval, a comrade. So I tried to be kind of aware of that, that I am writing at the moment for a primarily English audience, but I also try to do other political work on the side, of course. So in that sense, I think I get my strength from feminism mostly, to kind of dismantle some of these artificial ideas about objectivity and bias. I don't think anybody is biased. I think people who pretend to be very unbiased are lying or they're not reflecting enough. And oftentimes it's the privilege that usually white men in powerful positions have, that they can claim to have this universal perspective and they're not attached to any cause, not attached to any issues. So I don't see it that way. But I do think it's very important also for me to be kind of reflexive of the immense privilege and safety that I have vis-a-vis the people that I'm writing about. So I overthink very often what I write and how, and that's why in recent years I try to shift also my attention to criminalization, to the state and stuff, and to not claim that I can know the experiences of people who are, for example, to connect this to your second question about forced displacement, I think so it's not something that I have worked on, especially the question of water. I really like to refer to the work of other people, for example, Ercan Ayboğa or Azize Aslan and other people who have written much better stuff, you know, from an ecological perspective. But I think because also my work on forced displacement in Kurdistan was mainly in Syria and in Iraq, not inside Turkey, because eventually I left Turkey and I don't think I'm planning to go there at the moment for different reasons. It's not possible to do the research I was able to do during the peace process. That I don't think it's possible for many people to do kind of some forms of research as openly anymore as it was possible when I was doing my fieldwork in Turkey. So, but what I think is something very important is what you say, and you emphasize also this emotional relationship that people have to nature, that the state policies are not just about security and just kind of displacing people because of, you know, geopolitical interests, but really it's a severing of ties that people have to land. And it's something that happened before also. I mean, it happened in the context of the Turkish Republic, from the Armenian genocide, the CISRUL, the genocide against the Syriacs, Assyrians, Chaldeans, against Greeks, against Kurds. So people are being systematically deprived of their relationship to the lands, to the history, to each other, to different forms of life, and turned into these citizens inside this neoliberal state. So I think it's really above all also a spiritual attack. The scenes that we've seen, I think in 2019, when Hasankeyf was submerged by water because of the dam projects, they had this very clear colonial aesthetic. The Turkish state found it necessary to drape the more so-called valuable sites with Turkish flags, and then, you know, it was elderly people who were praying to the water and to the land, and it was just, it's really, you know, you can compare it with so many other colonial encounters in history, right? It's a very, very violent form of genocide and ecocide entangled. And I think I don't want to say so much about this question of water because I don't work on it, and I would refer to other people's work. But I think in general, anyone who's working on forced displacement, and this is something you can see also, for example, I stayed in Shengal, in Sinjar, a year after the genocide of ISIS in 2015. In the summer, I was there. And just the way people were narrating what had happened to them in these like very spiritual ways tells you this is not something, the solutions also cannot be that you just find some kind of legal arrangement on how this place should be administered and run, and who should be in charge of what, and what kind of army should have legacy over this. It's a much more profound kind of deeply philosophical way about how you think about the relationship between human beings and the nature, and that we are part of nature, and that there are some communities still who haven't fully assimilated into these nation-state citizenship kind of ideas, who really feel the love for the mountains, for the forests, for the waters that they live with, because it's part of them. And I think the work of, for example, indigenous scholars also writing in totally different contexts has been very enlightening for me, even if the context is different. But yeah, it's a very, very sad topic, and I hope more people will, even if they're not experts on ecology, that they will consider ecology, ecocide as part of forced displacement and the violence it inflicts on human souls, I think. Thank you so much for your question, Cansu. And again, I cannot do anything other than apologize for being such a person who can't stop when hearing great questions.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions and the answers alike. We have two hands up, Elise and Maxim. Maxim is kindly waving his place to Elise. If we take probably 3 to 4 minutes for each question, then probably we will have time like 5 minutes over, and we can maybe address Gal's question in the messages as well. So go ahead, Elise, please.
Okay, I'll try and keep this one short. And I think it kind of relates to some of the things that you've already covered. But Earlier in the interview, you mentioned the concept of democratic nation, and I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on this. I guess as a kind of alternative to nationalism, for example, or yeah, how communities can be bound by ethical principles or democratic culture. So yeah, just if you could elaborate a little, that would be great.
And I think this is actually something I can answer quite shortly, because I think mainly it's a good thing to just, you know, refer to the existing readings or other things to really get a much more in-depth. And I know you are working yourself on these questions as well, Elise. So I think I would compare the democratic nation concept a little bit, maybe not exactly, but to what the Zapatistas are describing often as a world in which many worlds fit. So I don't know if this is me overstepping, but I think, you know, it's comparable, because the idea of democratic nation, which is a concept that Öcalan proposed in his prison writings in the 5-volume manifesto for democratic civilization, is a different way of thinking about identity, about kind of belonging, about community, that is not based on these very artificial and symbolic kind of ways on social engineering, basically, projects of the nation state in particular. I mean, Turkey is a very good example for that. You know, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire created a system inside Turkey through violence and genocide of different identities, where the existence of different groups of people was systematically denied. So you just deny the existence of different life forms. And this is what led to a very intense and very difficult to overcome form of nationalistic thinking that normalizes violence. So borders, flags, symbols, in this view, are meaningless. So we need to create meaning by rallying around shared common principles, right? And these should be progressive, revolutionary ones, if you will. For example, women's liberation. So in this sense, it's a term that is employed in different ways in the movement, in different contexts. For example, in Rojava, it's the basis for this like plurinational self-administration. And inside Turkey, it's also for progressive alliances. For example, democratic nation is part of the vocabulary of the People's Democratic Party, which has brought back old legacies of solidarity with the Turkish left, with different minority groups. So, you know, people, for example, Armenians, Roma people who don't have any kind of presence in the agenda of other political parties can see themselves in this concept, because the political party does not see itself as just a Kurdish party. Of course, the main base of it is mostly Kurdish, but it's a very open approach. And also the Kurdish youth movement, for example, inside Europe is fostering anti-fascist alliances with different groups inside Europe. So, for example, often in these educations, political educations that the movement in Europe is organizing, it's also encouraging Europeans, for example, to divorce themselves from the history, from the violent and colonial history of their own countries by looking for legacies of democratic resistance. For example, land struggles for the commons in Europe. You know, there's a huge feminist legacy, for example, by people like Silvia Federici and others about the witch hunts that happened inside Europe. So what are the histories of resistance, of democracy, of liberation, of solidarity, of anti-war struggles, of anti-apartheid struggles that people have led also to say, not in my name, in Europe, for example? How many people resisted against fascism in Europe? This is also, you can think about your history in this way. You don't have to think about British history only through the British Empire. There are so many social struggles also that happened. And then there's Scottish specific history, the history of resistance in Scotland, and so many other things, right? So in that sense, it's a new kind of way of thinking about community making through intentional politics, but it's quite different. I think it has a political agenda in the sense that, of course, there are many left movements, radical traditions in different parts of the world, where it's more like safe havens, like social centers or squads, where people live kind of alternatively outside of capitalist structures or try to have forms of mutual aid and so on. But often these don't really have a claim to change society. It's more about creating a safe space for you and your comrades. So I think what the Kurdish movement is trying to do is also to kind of go out of that bubble and to say, we need to take this approach also to wider constituencies. It needs to be a mass struggle. So it's combining these two things, like, you know, more 21st century oriented global struggles with older forms of revolutionary socialist organizing familiar from the 20th century, which were much more mass and, you know, kind of lower class based, by really knocking on people's doors and saying, are you coming to the protest? And so I think this is what I would say is like this kind of sense of we are creating a new global democratic front through concepts like world democratic confederalism. Democratic confederalism is not just for the Kurds. The women's movement is organizing world women's democratic confederalism, engagement with, you know, prison struggles in different parts of the world, connecting struggles. And I think increasingly social movements in different parts of the world are doing that, you know, a new internationalism that is not focused on relationships between states, but between struggles and between movements. So in that sense, democratic nation about overcoming strict, rigid kind of categories that were imposed by states and flags and, you know, systems of power, and braiding a new sociability of based on principles and ethics and solidarity from below and across people, especially those that have historically been marginalized by state power. And I think the women's movement has a specific role to play there.
Thank you, Dilar. I think our time is over, but we can stay 5 minutes longer if you have time at your hands, and listen to what Maxim has as a question. Go ahead, Maxim.
Yeah, thank you. So that was really, really interesting, and there's a lot to address. So I think one thing that you said in the beginning is when you were talking about this sort of multifaceted sort of community based on an ethical praxis, which kind of like which includes like political activism, of course, but also music and dance and a wide variety of practices. So I think that kind of resonates with a very broad understanding of like what active citizenship would be like. And I think that's super important, and especially in a context like this one. At the same time, it's also hard to deny that sort of formal citizenship as a legal status does offer real protections to those lucky enough to fall on the right side of it. And of course, that's where the problems originate, because then it's the state that kind of decides who's deemed worthy of that protection and who isn't. But do you think, either in your view or whether that's shared within the Kurdish movement more generally, is there in their struggle a sort of view towards a future institutionalization of their community, that they aim for a citizenship that is analogous to that many states today bestow upon their citizens, or do they look for a radically alternative model, or no kind of institutionalization at all? So basically, what's the kind of drive towards institutionalization going on there?
That's a very, very good question. I really hope we will get more time to talk about this at the conference. I'm just so embarrassed at how I'm not able to stick to time. So I'm really sorry for giving you such a short answer. So I really promise we can continue this in the conference. But I think the question of institutionalization is very important, because within the movement, there is a focus on institutionalization of, sorry, it's a difficult word, institutionalization within the movement. So to really enshrine in documents or in decisions in Congress resolutions what has been decided and how to do it, and to really formalize the existing structures for the internal movement, if you know what I mean. So this is also for transparency and accountability, to make sure we know how the decisions flow from Kurdistan to Europe and back and so on. So there is institutionalization is very important for the internal democracy of the movement. But when it comes to how that relates to the existing system of the state and capitalism around it, it's much more difficult. And I think it expresses itself in different ways in the different struggles. In Turkey, for example, people often call engagement with legal political struggles. I mean, the HDP is a legally elected party inside the parliament. There are municipalities. Of course, these are constantly under attack and politicians are repeatedly imprisoned. So it's often described as negotiation and struggle. So on one hand, you try to change the state, you try to kind of democratize it, smash some of its aspects that cannot be, reconciled with, freedom and liberation and democracy. For example, the struggle for changing the constitution and so on. So on one hand, there is engagement with that world, right? To make it different, to organize it differently, but also parallel to that, you have your own system. Inside Rojava, it's the same. People couldn't just come and say, from now on, everybody will be run by communes and cooperatives. If so many people don't have a concept of these terms, that's why political education was so important. But there was a long-term community that had familiarity with these concepts. So they went ahead and did that, but parallel to it, a more representative kind of structure was kind of like a more state-like system was also built. So it's representational democracy and radical democracy, struggling also inside and sometimes with the same people. So you see sometimes the youth movement, the revolutionary youth movement, goes and does its thing, attacks a building, and then inside the administration there are people condemning it and some people who are happy with it, because it's like not a externally designed system. And I think this is why, for example, we see there's a university in Rojava. It's seeking kind of relationships to universities for accreditation, for access to libraries, for access to resources, but it doesn't need to be acknowledged by the outside system in order to function and fulfill its job in the meantime for empowering communities. So I'm just giving a very vague overview about the existing struggles, but I don't think there is a long-term kind of vision to have a system that everybody recognizes. But in some cases, for example, the recognition of Rojava and giving it a political status would really help protect it from being attacked by the Turkish state. Or one of the things that, it's not the struggle for a Kurdish state, but any kind of political recognition of the Kurdish people as a people in the international sphere, similar to, for example, the Palestinians, would also help bring certain grievances to international systems. It's not possible for Kurdish people oftentimes to hold countries like Turkey accountable because there is no recognition of them in international. So you need it for some purposes, but you also don't need it in order to do other things in the meantime. For example, long-term strategic things like empowering people. So these are very difficult questions, and I don't think there's a clear answer to it, but I think things happen and they evolve as developments also happen. So, but thank you so much for your question. I'll think about it also for the conference.
Thank you very much, Dilar. It has been an absolute pleasure and a genuine pleasure to have you. And thank you very much for your very passionate engagement and answers to the questions. I will give floor to Elise and Maxim. Thank you very much for organizing this talk, and floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much to Dilar and Hanifi. This has been really, really amazing to listen to. And yeah, very much looking forward to the conference and picking up some of these conversations then. Just a very quick note that the next interview with our third keynote, Bonnie Honeck, is Maxim, I don't quite remember, is it the 13th of May?
It is the 13th of May, yeah.
What time? Is it 4:30?
It's I have to do the math now. It's 11:30 on the US East Coast, so that makes it 4:30 in the UK. Yeah.
There we go. So yeah, we hope to see many of you there as well, and we'll send around links for that too. And yes, thank you, Dilar. Just so you're.
Thank you. I wanted to say also thank you so much, Hanifi, Maxim, Elise, Trevor, and everybody who was here. I just really can't wait to meet you all in person. And this has been such a nice, positive space, and your questions were great. And I can't thank you enough for sharing this space. Thank you.
Thank you. Trevor, should we stop the recording? I don't know how to do that.